Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Welcome to episode 8 of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. Today, I'm doing something a little bit different on the podcast, and I have a listener question. Debbie had a question, and so she recorded her question for us to listen to. So let's listen to what Debbie had to say.
Hi, Melanie. My question is about adding calcium to your meal when you have oxalate in your food choices for a meal. I wonder, do you have to have a whole serving of milk or cottage cheese or yogurt, or can you just have a few bites? Adding all that additional calcium does increase the calorie content of the meal by a lot, so I wonder if a few bites will be enough.
So thank you, Debbie, so much for such a wonderful question. I've definitely been asked this before. I think sometimes dairy gets a bad rap for many, many reasons, but that's a whole nother podcast. But one of the reasons that people are concerned about dairy is that it does add some calories, just like all food has calories. All food is going to give us energy, and that's actually a good thing. So before I dive into my thoughts about the calories in dairy, I thought maybe it would be good to back up and talk a little bit more about why calcium is important in the first place. Maybe we have new listeners here who don't really know, why are we talking about calcium anyway? I think especially since calcium for kidney stones is kind of counterintuitive. There's a lot of bad information floating around out there. Even from doctors, I hear almost daily, unfortunately, that people's doctors are still telling people to avoid calcium if you have calcium stones. And this is incredibly outdated and honestly dangerous advice for people who have calcium stones. This is I think maybe 3 decades or so ago, we learned that people who consume enough calcium, and many of us are not consuming enough calcium, but when you do consume enough calcium, it can actually lower your risk of oxalate stones by about 50%. And the reason, I know that's very counterintuitive. You think, my goodness, I have calcium stones. Why in the world would I need to eat more calcium? Why shouldn't I stop eating calcium? And the reason for that is what happens to calcium and oxalate in your intestines or in your gut. So calcium and oxalate love to bind, right? That's why they make kidney stones, which isn't ideal. But we can use that love to our advantage when we eat calcium-containing foods with oxalate. So if we are eating a healthy diet, as all of us should be, it's going to have oxalate in it. That's just the nature of the beast. We cannot follow a zero oxalate diet. That would not be a healthy diet for anyone. And so when we eat calcium with our meals, that calcium is going to bind with oxalate in our intestine, and then that complex basically gets excreted in our stool or in our poop instead of that oxalate getting absorbed into our system and eventually getting excreted in our urine. And so by this means, basically by making sure we are eating enough calcium, ideally with our meals, so we can really use that binding to our advantage, we can really lower urine oxalate levels. And we know from clinical experience and from studies that actually making sure that you are eating enough calcium is actually a much more effective way at lowering urine oxalate levels versus trying to count how much oxalate you're eating and trying to cut back how much oxalate you're eating. Plus, we know that a very low oxalate diet is going to be very limited in fruits and vegetables and whole grains and nuts and seeds and lots of things that are really good for us, ironically, in general, and as well for kidney stone prevention. But that's a whole other podcast. So this is why we actually want to make sure we are getting enough calcium for many people, is because it's so good at making sure to keep it's so good at lowering those urine oxalate levels. The other reason that calcium is really important for stone formers is actually bone health. And this is relevant for people who honestly have any type of calcium stone, whether it's calcium oxalate or calcium phosphate. People who have these calcium-based stones are just at a greater risk of bone disease. Things like bone fractures, osteopenia, osteoporosis, kidney stones, and bone disease just unfortunately kind of go hand in hand. And a lot of it has to do with this calcium piece. So a lot of times we're forming stones stones because of high urine calcium. And we have high urine calcium because our body, unfortunately, for whatever reason, just keeps stealing that calcium from our bones and excreting it in our urine, which is forming stones and also, of course, putting our bones at risk. And so the other reason that calcium is so important is just for bone health. We know that eating enough calcium is good for our bones, right? And so that's kind of the other piece. So I really think about calcium as being so important for stone formers for two big reasons. One, to keep that urine oxalate down by binding that oxalate in our gut and excreting that oxalate in our stool. And the other thing is this bone piece. And so what do the official guidelines say about this calcium thing? So the official guidelines from the American Urological Association recommend that for people who have high urine oxalate, that they get in somewhere between 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium from food per day. Ideally, this is from food. We generally, for most people, do not want to be getting calcium from supplements because that's actually associated with a higher risk of stones. And so in order to get that 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams per day, we really should be getting in 3 servings of dairy per day. Each serving of dairy is going to vary, of course, but it's going to give us somewhere between 100 to 300-ish milligrams of calcium per day. So if we, this all is kind of an estimate, right? Nutrition is not an exact science. So if we take that 3 servings of 200-ish milligrams of calcium per day times 3, plus the little bits of calcium we're going to get in all sorts of things, there's a little bit of calcium in broccoli and different vegetables, like it all kind of shakes out in the end. I really encourage people to get that full serving of dairy, full serving 3 times per day, and ideally with meals. I mentioned this earlier, but we really want to be getting that calcium in with meals. So it's sort of maximizing that binding ability with the oxalate in our gut. So really, we do want to be getting in those 3 servings per day. So I'm getting to your question, Debbie, about those calories. So if we look at how many calories this dairy is actually adding, it's not really that significant. So of course it's going to vary. Calories are going to vary based on what types of dairy you're choosing and whether you're choosing low fat, fat-free, or whole milk options. But just kind of for context, I looked up at the USDA Food Nutrient Database, which is kind of my go-to place to get nutrition information. So I found that 1 cup of skim milk is going to be somewhere around 80 calories, which is not that many. If you choose whole milk, that's going to be, of course, more because there's more fat in it, and that's going to be around 150 calories. If we look at yogurt, so fat-free yogurt made from skim milk is going to be maybe somewhere around 135 calories, whereas full-fat yogurt made from whole milk is going to be more like 150, similar to that glass of whole milk. Cheese is going to be very different, but an ounce of cheese is going to be somewhere around like 115-ish calories per serving or per ounce serving. So, this is sort of, even if you're getting in those 3 servings of dairy per day, that's only 300 calories across the whole course of the day. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about, when you might want to choose low fat versus full fat dairy options, because there really isn't a one choice that's always best. Of course, the fat-free or skim milk options are going to be lower in calories and they're going to be lower in fat. But these things also are not going to have as much satiation because fat does a lot of really wonderful things for us, and one of those things is helping us feel full longer and feel satisfied after we eat, which is important because we want to feel full after we eat. So that's one thing. And so if, for me, I tend to choose either full fat or reduced fat options overall, but especially for breakfast. I tend to have yogurt for breakfast with some berries and some granola. That's just easy for me in my life right now with two 15-year-olds at home. Everything has to be quick and easy. And so I actually steer clear of fat-free options because, especially since that's all I'm having for breakfast, I really need some of that sticking power, right? I'm not having any other foods to add that fat to it. But for my dairy that's maybe at lunch and dinner, I'm likely having that dairy with other things, right? Maybe a sandwich that has some mayonnaise on it, maybe, vegetables that are cooked in oil, whatever, right? There's going to be some other component of that meal that has some fat to it. So I'm not so worried about adding that fat, and there's also probably going to be other sources of protein, et cetera, to help keep me full. So, it's not always best to choose the lowest calorie option. It's going to depend on lots of other things. The other big benefit of choosing a a dairy product that has more fat in it is you're going to absorb the fat soluble vitamins and minerals better. The big one here is vitamin D. Vitamin D, many of us are deficient in it, especially those of us that live in the north. And you need fat to absorb that vitamin D. So again, especially for me, it tends to be breakfast. And I think this is true for a lot of people when you are having not a lot of other foods with that dairy, to give us that fat in the dairy is going to be really great, both for that satiety factor as well as to help me absorb that vitamin D and the other fat soluble vitamins and minerals. So, it's less of an issue again for the other meals because I'm going to have something else in there that has fat. But just again, something to think about. Calories are not the end all be all of things that we should be choosing. The other thing to think about with this calcium thing, and do we really need the 3 servings of dairy per day, is the 3 servings of dairy per day is actually what's recommended exactly the same in the dietary guidelines for Americans. So although this calcium piece is especially important for people who have calcium oxalate stones or any type of calcium stone, this is actually what's recommended for the general population anyway, just for like that bone health piece mostly. So, it really is beneficial to get in all of this dairy if you can. I also wanted to mention how much calcium you need to eat to bind with X amount of oxalate, because that's a question that I get almost every day is like, okay, we understand that this calcium is so important to bind with oxalate, but how much calcium do I need to bind oxalate in the gut? I'm eating X, 100 milligrams of oxalate or whatever it is. How much calcium do I need to sort of neutralize or stop the absorption of that oxalate? And the answer is simply, I don't know. The data is not advanced enough for us to get that specific. And honestly, it would be probably impossible to do because it's going to depend on a gazillion factors. It's going to depend on how much fat is in that meal, whether that oxalate that you're eating is soluble versus insoluble, probably where that calcium is coming from, how much fiber you're eating, like all sorts of things. And so I highly discourage people to get this far in the weeds when it comes to kidney stone nutrition. That's just not how nutrition works. Again, because there's so many different factors that play into this. It is so much more important to take a step back and look at this from a big picture. We want to be, for those of us that it matters, depending on your 24-hour urine test, if the calcium is important for you, we really just want to make sure that we're getting in those 3 servings of dairy with meals, right? That makes it so much more simple. It would be a terrible way to eat, to be counting oxalate and counting calcium down to these milligram amounts. Instead, I like to think about it as food patterns, right? We want to be eating a dietary pattern that has plenty of plant foods in it, moderate amount of animal protein, getting in our calcium, right? These are the things that matter, instead of trying to stress, or not trying, but stressing out truly about these minute things that honestly doesn't matter, and we'd just be guessing anyway. So I wanted to mention that I cannot say that we need this much calcium to bind with this much oxalate. That data just simply doesn't exist. I would be literally making it up. So I just wanted to share that because that's a question that I get quite a bit. So kind of getting back to Debbie's question, I just wanted to finish with sort of my thoughts about calories and choosing foods based on calorie content and that sort of thing. And I actually hate counting calories with a vengeance. I think that it is no way to live. I would argue that basically no one should be counting calories because it makes us so anxious and honest, just like hypersensitive to food, and that's not how food should be. If we are truly listening to our bodies and we are getting rid of all of the external cues about what we should be eating, we're not listening to, oh, the clock, it's noon, I should be eating, or, oh, this is too big of a portion, I shouldn't be eating that. If we're really listening to our bodies, the amount of calories is going to kind of shake out in the end. If you add in this dairy, that's going to give you maybe some extra fat, definitely some extra calories. And so if we're really listening to our satiety cues and taking a step back, enjoying our meals, we're going to sort of adjust naturally in a different part of that meal. We're going to eat maybe a little bit less protein or whatever it is, right? I know this perception or this view of calories and eating may come as a shock to many people. I know this is very different than how we're sort of taught about how we should be eating and the exact portion sizes, but that's just not how it works, right? I think it is important to take things that you know are important for you. So for example, if you have stones and you have high urine oxalate, you know that getting in that calcium is important. So you're going to prioritize getting in that dairy or getting in that calcium in a way that works for you. But there's not going to be like an exact amount of grams of protein you should be eating or an exact amount of size of portions of vegetables, right? Like that's not how it works. What I hope you take from this podcast and all of my content, honestly, is these are just guidelines for you to take and modify and make and work for you. Take it and modify it and use it in a way that works for you in your life. Because whether we're talking about changing our diet for kidney stones or for heart health or diabetes or anything else under the sun, these are changes that we should be making for the rest of our lives, right? So it must be something that feels right to you. And you know your body a whole heck of a lot better than me, right? So take everything I say with a grain of salt, if you will, and make it work for you. So with that, I'm going to close this episode. Debbie, thank you so much for recording your question for the podcast. It's my very first listener question, so I very much appreciate it. If those of you listening would like to drop a question, I would love to hear from more of you. You can do so from a link. I'll put it in the show notes. So you just click on it and simply record just like Debbie did. And your question may get chosen to get answered on the podcast. So with that, thank you again for listening in, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. VIP enrollment includes help directly from me. I can't wait to see you there and help you prevent kidney stones. Have a great day.